Okay, so just continuing with where we left off, we were talking about this idea of we the people and how that Obama uses that to show that he's like everyone else. And we were down to this paragraph here, and there's a really interesting thing here where he says, but we reject the belief that America must choose between caring for the generation that built this country, so the past, and investing in the generation that will build its future, so the future. So here you can see that idea of the belief in that creed, so that all people are created equal, and we need to look after all people in the country. And here he says, like, to sort of add weight to his argument, he says, so we remember lessons of the past when twilight years were spent in poverty and parents of child. So this idea that there was no safety net or social security, as Americans would call it, and that they were dark times for America. Again, you've got this lots of high modality language going on here. We do not believe that this country's freedom is reserved for the lucky or happiness for the few. So you have, again, that egalitarian, unifying approach that he's taking here. And in here, he talks about something that's been quite controversial for his presidency. So, and he talks about the importance of things like Medicare and Social Security. Okay, so you've probably heard of something about Obamacare, which was like the security net for health services in America, which tend to be worse than the rest of the world, and how much it costs to pay for healthcare in America if you get really sick. But that was quite controversial in terms of Obama's presidency. It had a lot of support, but it had a lot of people who were against it as well. And he goes on to talk about this idea of like Social Security. And I suppose if you want to have like a dichotomy between the parties, so Obama's a Democrat, and the other party in America, main party, is the Republicans. So Obama and Kennedy are actually both Democrats, and they're generally more like our Labor Party here in Australia. So they're, I suppose, much more left-leaning and sort of believe in Social Security and like welfare. And that gets a lot of criticism in America, as it gets in Australia as well. But in here, he's sort of defending his position. He's saying that these Social Security initiatives don't make us takers. They help us. They help make our country great because they give people that safety net. He then moves on to talk about climate change. So he's talking about a lot of the things that are important in the current political climate, and probably things that are not actually very popular in terms of his non-supporters, and goes on to talk about, how knowing that climate change is real, or that there's a threat of climate change, that would be betraying our children and future generations. So very emotive language here, and appealing to that pathos and also ethos of the audience as well. So that ethics, that ethic and moral compulsion that we have, and it stems from that emotion of like putting yourself in the shoes of how would you feel if this was your child. So that's very effective in terms of getting his audience on side. I then want to move down to this paragraph here. Again, you've got that we the people. And here he does this kind of interesting extended metaphor. So still believing in enduring security and lasting peace do not require perpetual war, okay? So that idea that you can come to peaceful things without having wars to create peace, which is an oxymoron juxtaposition, if you think about it. So our brave men in uniform tempered by the flames of battle and unmatched in skills and courage. Our citizens seared by the memory of those they have lost. So you've got here this this flame and heat metaphor going on to look at the idea of sacrifice in the country, and that possibly there have been a lot of sacrifices in America, but it doesn't mean that it's the only way forward in the future of America. In this paragraph here, he talks about America remaining the anchor of strong alliances in every corner of the globe. Okay, so you've got a metaphor here of America being an anchor, so something that's strong, that holds everyone down and keeps everyone in place. And interestingly, he talks about in every corner of the globe, so very internationalist rather than isolationist here. We can see him reaching out to the whole world rather than America. Okay, so he's kind of, in terms of like the structure of his speech, he's looking at what's happened in the past, what needs to happen, and then what needs to happen in America, and also branching out further. And that's sort of the way that he gets his audience on board. And in this line here, he says, "For no one has a greater stake in a peaceful world than its most powerful nation." Okay, so the implication or the inference here is that the most powerful nation is America. Okay, and most people would agree with that. But it's interesting because that's done so that the audience, feel a sense of pride in their country that they are the most powerful nation. But he's saying that being the most powerful nation, there's also a responsibility, because if the world is not peaceful, then America is not peaceful. So greater stakes, so that idea that like greater interest, I suppose. He then goes on to talk about like this, because our interests and our conscience compel us to act on behalf of those who long for freedom. So here he's talking about the whole world, and he's talking about Americans needing to see that they have freedom and that they have that creed and that belief that's been set out in the Declaration of Independence, and that it is their duty as people who have that freedom to make sure that other citizens of the world have that same freedom, and that all citizens of the world are treated as equal. And that we must be a source of hope to the poor, the sick, the marginalised. Okay, so he's listing all of these people. And it's to appeal to the better nature of Americans as well. Okay, and again, he mentions that creed, and the creed about tolerance and opportunity, human dignity and justice. Okay, so he's listing that like sort of rule of three, like listing three things to sort of put your point across. And he's saying that this is something that Americans value, but we need to understand that we need to extend that to beyond our shores. He then here makes a reference to the Declaration of Independence. So again, we the people declare today that the most evident of truths, that all are created equal. Okay, so he's making that sort of reference, that allusion to the Declaration of Independence, which is scattered throughout the whole speech. And he's saying that this thing about being created equal was important 200 years ago, and it's just as important now. But we need to branch out so that it's not just about our men being created equal. It's about all men being created equal. In the last parts of his speech, he kind of goes on to talk about what he hopes for the future. So it is our generation's task to carry on what those pioneers began. So the pioneers, the people who created the Declaration of Independence, okay? So he's saying that the people who are here now, we've done great things in the past, but in 2013, we need to make sure that there's still work to be done, that the place is not perfect and that there's other things that we need to do, okay? And he goes on to list things about women giving equal opportunity, homosexual people giving equal opportunity, suffrage. So suffrage is about the opportunity to vote, about immigrants. There's lots of different things that he talks about, okay? So he says, our journey is not complete until all of our children know that they are cared for and cherished and always feel safe for harm. So he goes into that, like those big sort of things, those big issues about equal rights. And then he goes into sort of like zone in on our own children, again appealing to the emotions of the audience. And he says, this is our generation's task. Okay, so it's very definitive language to make these words, these rights, these values of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness real for every American. Okay, so going back to that creed, going back to, we've said this is what we believe in, we need to show that that is what we believe in. What else do I want to talk about? In this next one, he has a bit of an aphra again. So he's saying we must act knowing that our work will be imperfect. Okay, so it's the idea that yes, we might make mistakes, but if we don't act, that's a bigger mistake. Okay, so he says we must act, we must act. And it's the idea of leaving a legacy, I suppose. Okay, my fellow Americans, again, reference to lots of reference to that inclusive language that Kennedy used. Down here he says, but the words I spoke today are not so different from the oath that is taken each time a soldier signs up for duty or an immigrant realises her dream. My oath is not so different from the pledge we all make to the flag that waves above and fills our hearts with pride. So again, a lot of emotive language here appealing to the pathos of the audience. And it's important because, again, he's making himself an ordinary person. Okay, so he is a leader. He's the voice of a leader, but he's making himself an ordinary person who wants the same things as the people that he's speaking to. And again, he says here, which I think is exactly what I was just saying before, you and I as citizens have the power to set this country's course. You and I as citizens. So he's pointing out that they're all citizens together and that they all need to work towards the one cause, okay? So in terms of the voice, it's the voice of hope, it's the voice of change, it's the voice of equality, it's the voice of egalitarianism, but also the voice of patriotism and internationalism as well, and obviously a Democrat. So there's lots of different voices going on there. Like I said, make sure that you're thinking about how you can connect this to Kennedy's speech. So I've sort of made reference to a few of Kennedy's things in his speech, but there's lots more in terms of if you have a more detailed analysis, and have a think about how you could talk about them in conjunction with each other. Thanks, Year 12.